Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 108, and today we're looking at the Jesus-Joshua problem. In 3 recent episodes of the NT Pod, I've been reflecting a bit on issues around translation, specifically where an English translation hides a really interesting issue of interpretation instead of opening it up. What a translation should do, in my opinion, is open up the text to people, give the reader that doesn't have the original language some options for how to see a particular issue. So in one episode, I looked at the Synoptic Translation Problem, where similarities between the Gospels are masked by translation, where the same words are translated differently and different words are translated the same. That to me is problematic because it's closing down to the reader all sorts of interesting similarities and differences. I then talked about translation inertia, where key expressions just get stuck. So we keep saying stumbling block instead of thinking about other ways to translate the Greek word skandalon. And then last time, we started looking at the question of names, where you have the same names in Greek being translated differently in English. Jacob if it's before Jesus, James if it's contemporary with Jesus. And then we also looked at the question of Jude and Judas, 2 different ways of translating exactly the same Greek word. Yet there's something still more fundamental that I'd like to talk about today, and that relates to the person that everyone would agree is the central key figure in the New Testament, and that's Jesus. Now, the name Jesus is Jesus in Greek, and it's the same word as the Hebrew Joshua. Yes, Joshua. And how often do we hear that word Joshua when we read Jesus? I confess that when I use the term Jesus, I rarely hear Joshua in my head. And equally, when I use the word Joshua, I rarely hear the word Jesus in my head. Now, I realise, of course, that different cultures are different on this. Many English-speaking cultures do name their children Joshua and Josh, but they tend not to name their children Jesus. For example, in 30 years of teaching in British and American contexts, I've never yet had a student called Jesus, but I've had multiple Joshuas and Joshes. It's different, of course, in Hispanic cultures where Jesus is a bit more common. Gabriel Jesus, who plays for Arsenal in Brazil, he's a case in point. And in fact, Gabriel is, of course, another fine biblical name, which would be a great topic for a future NT pod. But as with the discussion in the previous podcast, I think there are some serious issues with making the Old Testament figure Joshua and the New Testament figure Jesus. It's a translation way of saying that you've passed through a kind of firewall at the end of the Old Testament when Jacob's become James's and Joshua's become Jesus's. The problem is it can come across as a way of saying that these characters, James's, are part of the New Testament, while that character, Jacob, is part of the Old Testament. This character, Jesus, is a new name for a New Testament in contrast to the Old Testament name Joshua. James, Jacob, Jesus, Joshua. It's interesting, actually, how rare the name Jesus is in the New Testament and how rare the name Joshua is in the New Testament compared to the James and Jacob issue. There are really only 2 more Jesuses in the New Testament. One is a character, Jesus, who is called Justus, and he sends his greetings in Colossians 4:11. He's named alongside several others, including, what fun, Mark and Luke. And this Jesus is said to be Jewish. He's said to be from the circumcision. So we've got Jesus who's called Justus. We don't really know anything more about that character. And then there's one other Jesus in the New Testament other than Jesus of Nazareth, and that's Jesus Barabbas. Jesus Barabbas is in Matthew 27:16-17. Matthew's the only one of the gospel writers to call Barabbas by his first name, Jesus. And even there, the name isn't in all of the manuscripts. But the NRSV updated edition, many other English translations do go with Jesus Barabbas. I think it probably is original to the text of Matthew. And one of the things that's fascinating about it is that you get a really different resonance when you hear in Matthew, whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah? Now, we could translate that. Whom do you want me to release for you, Joshua, son of the Father, or Joshua who is called the Messiah? You do hear it differently when you use those terms. It's interesting, in fact, that the NRSV and the NRSV Updated Edition do make Jesus Messiah here rather than Christ from the Greek. So it's interesting that we get the Greek Jesus, but the Hebrew Messiah. Really, if they were being consistent, they should probably be saying Jesus who is called the Christ here. So that's the three Jesuses that you get in most English translations of the New Testament. Jesus who's known as Justus, Jesus of Nazareth, and Jesus Barabbas. When we switch over and look at English translations of the New Testament and their use of the word Joshua, there are actually only three references. The first is in Luke's genealogy, a certain Joshua son of Eleazar. That's in Luke 3:29. And there again, it's a bit like the issue with Jacob and James in the sense that when you get someone in Jesus' genealogy, Bible translators treat that person as belonging to the Old Testament era, and so they translate him the Old Testament way. So in the same genealogy, we have Jesus of Nazareth, and then we have another Jesus, but this Jesus is translated Joshua. It's exactly the same word in that same passage, but one belongs to the Old Testament, so he's called Joshua. The other belongs to the New Testament, and so that's Jesus. Now, the other two references to Joshua in the New Testament refer to Joshua, son of Nun, and he's the guy who has an entire Old Testament book named after him. It's actually amazing that there's so little reflection on this character in the New Testament, given his pivotal importance in Israel's history. You might almost have expected New Testament authors to be reflecting on how he relates to Jesus and parallels, with Jesus, but we don't generally get many of them at all. In fact, there are only really these two references to Joshua. One is in Acts 7:45 in Stephen's speech, which is like a kind of summary of the Old Testament. The second one is in Hebrews 4:8. And in Hebrews 4:8, really interesting, Hebrews 4 is talking about the concept of a Sabbath rest, the concept that the people of God were promised some kind of Sabbath rest that they had never really entered into. And for the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, who's not named, this rest is now happening with Jesus. So in context in Hebrews 4, this is how the reference to Joshua comes about, and I'm quoting here, Hebrews 4, 8-10. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not speak later about another day. So then a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. For those who enter God's rest also rest from their labours, as God did from his. It looks like this is a comment on how Joshua, the Old Testament Joshua, did not, in fact, deliver rest for God's people. And now, for the author of this epistle, the New Testament Jesus has finally delivered this rest for his people. Now, the King James Version here does something wonderful. It translates each occurrence of the Greek word Jesus here as Jesus. So it doesn't go Joshua, then Jesus. It just says Jesus both times. So in Hebrews 4:8, if Jesus, and this is Old Testament Jesus, Joshua, Hebrews 4:8 in the King James Version, for if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? So you hear that resonance. You hear that there are two Jesuses being contrasted with one another. The Old Testament one who didn't give people rest, and the New Testament one who did. It's a bit like talking about second Adams, new Moses, this kind of thing. You've got a new Joshua. Now, whatever we make of the exegesis of passages like Hebrews 4, I think one thing is clear, and that's that the ways we translate names in the Bible are important. And once again, it's a shame if we hide interesting interpretational issues behind the translation. The translations should be opening up the text, not closing it down, not hiding interesting nuances. On the other hand, Joshua Messiah Superstar doesn't quite have the same ring to it as Jesus Christ Superstar. But maybe that's a conversation for another day. Well, thanks so much for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's always a pleasure to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. I've got a YouTube channel, Podacre, and if you just Google for Mark Podacre, you'll find me on social media and in different places. Thanks again for listening. Bye-bye.